kidding. But let me move on to just saying a little bit about myself. So I'm Dr. Carmel Waltonen, and I teach in the university writing program. I have been at Davis for 20 years. I started going to conferences when I was a little baby scholar getting my master's degree. That was over 20 years ago. And it wasn't as scary as I thought it was going to be. And I learned really quickly that the worst thing when you put that proposal out there that anybody can do is just to say, no, we weren't able to take it. It's never mean, it's never anything, but I was surprised as a baby scholar how often people said, we love that idea, come to this conference. This is the only way I get to travel. And so I do actively seek out a lot of conferences to be able to do that. Before COVID, I was sometimes averaging 10 conferences a year, domestic and international. I'm also the president of the Margaret Atwood Society and the editor of Margaret Atwood Studies. So I also look at conferences from the point of view of somebody who's arranging panels and arranging conferences in addition to just speaking at them. So I'm bringing the experience of those years and sort of both sides, and the experience of having seen so many wrong ways to do it and so many right ways to do it. And I think if I share those good ways and those wrong ways, that maybe we can get something out of this. All right, so let's talk about that proposal first. And what you want to do, of course, is to really think about how to decode their instructions. And so that means when you read that short description, you want to say, okay, how literal are they being? Like maybe it's a Shakespeare conference and they say they're interested in talking about Shakespeare's late works. What does late mean to the conference organizer? What year is their cutoff? And so, you know, you might be wondering that, or you might be thinking how narrow. A lot of times they'll tell you pretty explicitly what they're thinking about. So I've seen a lot of conference proposals that will say, we will take any aspect of this, but we are especially seeking papers on this person's new work. And that means, yes, you're welcome to do something on the person's early work, but you have that leg up if you're doing it on the newer work. And so pay attention to those clues and those signals. But if they say we're especially looking for, you can still submit the other idea. And they might actually find a way that your paper on that earlier work fits well with the other papers that they pick for that panel on the other thing. And so you shouldn't not go for it just because they have that especially there. But you do want to read the instructions really closely because they are telling you what they're looking for. If they're written well. I'm assuming they're written well. As you're then working, you want to, if you can, ask some questions. So for example, you know, that person who said Shakespeare's late work and you're really not sure what they meant, you can send a quick, polite email and say, are you considering this work middle period or late period? Quick little email, they'll answer you and then you'll know. You can also, if you have colleagues who aren't just starting out, and you do, of course, and you know, they're your professors, you can ask them about how a conference has worked before. I was recently going to a conference, the Association for Adaptation Studies, for the first time. My colleague and friend, Pam, goes to that conference every single year. And so when I was thinking about proposing for the first time to them, I had two ideas. And one of them was just sort of more typical, that I thought it was about a work that a lot of people would write on. And it was actually about Atwood. You know, the Handmaid's Tale adaptation is hugely famous and gets written about a lot. And as an Atwood scholar, I could very easily, I already have a presentation on the adaptation of the show, but I didn't want to just be one more Atwood paper if I could do something a little more interesting. But I asked Pam, I said, do they tend to play it safe and want, you know, that piece on that work that everybody's familiar with, or could I be more experimental? And she said, oh, I think they would love the more experimental. And so that's the one I did, and that's what I went to, and it worked. So ask in your circle if there are people who've been to that conference before, if they have advice for you on how to craft the proposal. Some places, especially the bigger, fancy kind of frou-frou conferences that don't take many papers, they'll sometimes have on their website sample successful proposals. And they're trying to help you. They're trying to say, this is the type of tone we like. These are the type of subjects that we like. And you'll be able to see from those whether this is a conference that likes a lot of jargon in their abstract, where it's really, you know, theory, or whether they want practical language. You can see whether those abstracts always have keywords underneath. You'll be able to tell that. Go look through past conference programs. I don't know of any conference that doesn't put last year's program online. And the abstracts aren't always there, but the titles of the papers are. And so you can go see what are the kinds of things that got in last year, so that you can think about whether your paper would fit. And so that's that third point, looking at those past conference programs. You should also know that some conferences really, really encourage grad students. I know that whenever I can, I love having some grad students on the panels that I organize, you know, to have their entry into the field and to hear the ideas that they're coming up with. There are some conferences where that just really isn't possible. The Modern Language Association, for example, they'll have a couple of panels that are specifically marked as grad panels. And then that's where they think your place is, not on a regular panel. And when I propose panels for them, as I do every year, they're asking me to give the CV of these people, because they want to make sure that these are experts in the field. These are big names, because it's one of the big frou-frou conferences. So sometimes you can learn about the conference that way in terms of whether you might get in or not get in. So do be thinking about that. For your proposal, I also want you to really pay attention to that length. If they say they want something between 250 words and 500 words, that is what they want. And you do not get any extra points for giving them something that's 1,000 words. None of us, when we see that thing that's twice as long as it's supposed to be, none of us say, oh, what a brilliant person, I must have them at my panel. We all say, oh, this person cannot follow instructions, so this person is not going to follow my instructions about how long the presentation is going to be. They might not follow my instructions on what kind of AV situation we're going to have. They might think that they can go over on their paper just like they went over on their abstract and just take it over. So really get that length down. More and more, since these things are online, sometimes you literally cannot give something that goes over that limit if you're in the kind of text box with a word or character count thing. The MLA panels that I put together, I solicit papers on a theme. I get a bunch of abstracts in. I pick the 3 papers that I think are going to work the best together. And that's part of the trick. Like sometimes when you don't get it onto the panel, it's not a statement at all about how cool your paper was. It was just, it didn't fit well with those other 2 things that were there. And so you should never feel badly that you don't get in. When I have my 3 picked out, and then I go to propose the panel to the MLA, they have a whole section where I'm supposed to tell them how smart everybody is and, you know, what colleges their professors at and stuff. But the actual proposal for the panel for MLA is 35 words, including the title. And it is the hardest thing I write all year. I can't write 36. Because it won't let me submit. Sometimes I feel like it's hazing. It's just kind of like, okay, if you're really serious about trying to get into MLA, you will follow our very, very short policy here. But it teaches you to watch your wordiness. So watch the length. only send what they ask for. If I don't ask for your CV, don't send it to me. Especially if you're worried, like being a baby scholar, that they're not going to take you seriously. Well, don't send the CV then. I prefer the conferences where I'm just looking at your ideas and whether I want to hear more about those ideas on this panel and whether I think the audience wants to know that. And so don't go overboard there, or, you know, send me a list of other publications with links and stuff. If I haven't asked, it's not important to me, and you don't want to deluge someone with all of that material. You want to think about having a good title, not that we're judging on title, but if your title, when I read it, if my first thought is, I definitely want to read the rest of this abstract, then there is something that says in my mind. And when someone is flipping through the conference program, they're gonna want to also come to this, that there's something to that. If I were gonna go to a medical conference, a health conference or something, and the title of someone's paper was just malaria, well, I'm not going to that. I know what malaria is. If your title sounds like a Wikipedia entry, well, no, you gotta give me something. Even if you said treatments for malaria, I know the treatments for malaria. What you gotta do is say something cool like new treatments for malaria. Hey, now I want to go because I don't know the new treatments for malaria. That's going to work for me. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be clickbaity. It doesn't have to be any of those things. It just has to be specific enough so that someone can make the decision to see your paper and not somebody else's. At most conferences, there are concurrent panels happening at the same time in different rooms. And sometimes you want to see the first paper in this room and the second paper in this room, and you're running between the rooms trying to guess when something's going to start and stop. And then it's always awful because, like, in this room, they're like, why don't we go in alphabetical order instead of the order on the sheet? That poor person misses your face. But people are judging usually based on the title. Every once in a while, it's based on, I know them from grad school, so I'm going to so you want, for someone flipping through, to find the interest there. And again, the abstract is usually not necessarily on that program. So title and your name is all they have to go on. I, many years ago, was giving a paper on the film Fight Club. This was after it came out. And of course, if I had just titled my paper Fight Club, well, you know, if you've seen that movie, the title sounds like I'm simply going to summarize the film. And so that doesn't mean anything. I was at a conference that I had presented at before, and I knew that I could be playful with it. And I was going to be talking about masculinity in Fight Club. And so the title I picked was How to Avoid Bitch Tits and Keep Your Balls, Mandating Masculinity in Fight Club. And people came to that paper. They wanted to hear what I was going to do. And I was also promising, by the playfulness of the title, to be more playful and interesting in the presentation, which I definitely did try to do. But that, you know, using that kind of language, I knew would work at that conference. That language would not, of course, work everywhere. And that's just something you have to keep in mind as you're working. The deadlines. So what I do, and this is true for conference proposals, it's also true for letters of rec and other things like that, is that I go into my master calendar and I put it on my list to do a full week before it's actually due. And I try to do it on that day. The reason I give myself that week buffer, though, is because life happens. And what if I've waited until the last day to write that letter of recommendation or to write that proposal, but then I have a migraine and I've screwed that student because I could not get my stuff it on time? Or what, you know, if my car broke down that day and I had to deal with that kind of crap? It does require, of course, discipline and staying on it, but just giving myself that due date, seeing on any given Tuesday, I have to write that proposal today. Well, I do. It also, of course, if I get stuck on some aspect of that proposal, it gives me the ability to say, that last sentence is awful and I'm too tired to think of a way to fix it, but I can then fix it the next day. It also gives me that buffer where I can email it to one of my best friends and writing partners or something and say, please help me with this last sentence, because for the life of me, I cannot figure out how to sell this, or, you know, for the life of me, I can't figure out whether I'm actually giving them what they want. And it also is helpful because it gives me the time I need to tweak it. So when you're writing your proposal, you want to make sure that you are crafting something that clearly speaks to what they asked. I sometimes give very similar papers, and that's because I'm still working on the ideas and I want a different audience to hear it. But that proposal will get tweaked to make sure that the conference organizer knows that I'm not off topic. So for example, I was supposed to go to Verona, Italy in a couple of months to give a presentation at a suspicion conference. I'm not going to be able to do that anymore because COVID. But what I was talking about, what the plan was to talk about the ways that I teach my students in the University Writing Program to evaluate their sources, to use the reliable news instead of the unreliable news, to use the reliable academic sources rather than the unreliable academic sources. And just PS side note for those of you who just went, wait, are there unreliable academic sources? If you don't know what a predatory journal is, you want to look that up. And that's the existence of those completely unreliable journals that are passing as real. Their existence is why we always want you to find your sources through our library databases, because if you're on Google Scholar, you will be getting fake journals pulled in. But anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about. How does that fit in with suspicion? Well, the way that I sold it was that suspicion usually has a negative connotation, but I wanted to talk about how in literacy studies and in source work, we want our students to be suspicious. We want them to be questioning, and we want them to be challenging. And so, and it was just, you know, another sentence that I added in to explain the link, but it worked. So again, you know, if I was doing it at the last minute, I might not have had the time to really think through making that connection. So you figure out what your procrastination problem is, and we all procrastinate. We all do it. I don't know anybody who doesn't, especially for stuff that's hard, like writing a proposal. Figure out what's going on with that for you and figure out how to wrestle that demon. Now, for the deadlines, of course, the next question is, can you be late? It depends. If I set a deadline and you send something the next day and I haven't already, like, of the people who were on time, I don't have a solid panel, I'll look at your thing. But if I got, you know, 50 proposals, I easily narrowed it down to 3. There's no reason, you know, because I have these backups of people who were already on time, then I'm not going to take yours late. But sometimes, especially for smaller conferences, you don't get as many submissions. And so maybe I only got 5 abstracts and I only liked 2 of them. And then it's my choice. Well, do I pick one of the other ones that I didn't really like, or do I give yours a chance? And in that case, I would give yours a chance. This does not really work if you're very late. And you just need to be careful in your email to them. So apologize. Don't make excuses, though. You don't need to explain what was happening. It's not important. You can just say, I'm so sorry that I missed yesterday's deadline. I thought that I would send this to you just in case it was possible that you were still looking for things. If not, no worries. And then step away. Don't explain how tired you were, stressed you were, violent diarrhea, or whatever too much information you want to give to make up for it. Just apologize and move on, and then see what happens. And again, the worst thing that they can say is no, which is magic. Once you sort of accept that, I'm going to put myself out there for a conference. The worst thing they can say is, we had a bunch of great proposals. Yours didn't really fit. We were only able to take as many. Okay. That's fine. It's helpful to remember it's not even your fault necessarily. When you send in the abstract, it's usually via email, and this should just be short, polite. Mine tend to, if I know the person's name, and you don't always, but usually you do. And so I usually say, hi, Professor so-and-so, attached, please find my abstract to consider for this forthcoming conference on blah. Please let me know if there's anything else I can send you, right? Because I'm not going to send my CV and all that other stuff. And then I say, you know, cheers, or have a great day, or whatever. I don't try to, you know, explain to them why they definitely want to pick my paper. As someone who has organized conferences, though, I've had people try to spend a whole email telling me why I should pick their thing. And you know what? Your thing, the abstract that you send me should speak for itself. And it's either going to work or it's not going to work with the other things that I'm thinking about choosing. And that email that's, I mean, and some people are terribly obnoxious in them. I hate to tell you, but every once in a while you get somebody who says, after reading the rest of the proposals, you'll see that mine is far superior. And of course, that person, it does not matter how good their abstract is. I'm not putting them on the panel because they're a jerk, and I don't want to deal with a jerk. How do you know, after I've read the other things, that yours is going to look good? You don't know what other people are sending in to me. That's crazy. And I also know, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, that panels go better when no one's being a jerk on them. So that's one of the things that I really, really want to make sure happens, so that all of my speakers have a great time. As you're preparing, find out first thing how much time you have. Find out what AV setups are going to happen. Now, both of these things can shift, but I have a lot of people who they've maybe observed a conference, and maybe the conference they observed, everybody had 20 minutes, and then they walk away thinking everybody always gets 20 minutes at every conference. That is not true. And then they show up very wrong to that panel. And so ask. I promise that the organizer is going to be very, very, very happy to tell you how much time you have. In fact, they will probably go, oh, I should have mentioned that to everybody. And then you will get this email that's going out to everybody. Oops, I forgot to tell you everybody has 15 minutes or something like that. And then for the AV, I've seen a lot of people just assume that they're going to walk into something that is as beautifully set up as their computer classrooms on campus, where that's just not true. I have been in conferences where no internet is working the whole time. I have been in conferences where, like, there's a blackboard, there's nothing to plug anything into. And so you need to ask and not make any assumptions about what you're going to be able to use, right? I mean, today I made a PowerPoint. I assumed, I think rightly, that my computer would be working, and since this is an online talk anyway, that, you know, I mean, if something were wrong with the computer or with the internet, like, whether or not I had the PowerPoint wouldn't be even the problem. So make sure you ask that. As you're drafting, make sure that that draft that you're making comes in well under the time limit. I have seen a lot of people right before they're about to talk, and you'll hear them say, well, I know we have 20 minutes, but mine's at 22, so I'll just read really fast. Their solution to the problem is to become incomprehensible, and that is not a solution to the problem. First, you're probably going to speed up out of nervousness, especially if this is one of your first times. And intentionally speeding up on top of that is going to just be absolutely awful. What people also never figure out about timing themselves until they've screwed it up enough times, and I know this from screwing up enough times, just because somebody tells you that you have 15 minutes, that doesn't mean you really have that, because what happens is the last person who was at the podium comes back and sits down beside you, and then you go up and you might have to hook up your thing then, and as he's unhooking his thing, if they're separate systems, and then the conference person is gonna stand up and mispronounce your name and read your little bio or something, and 3 minutes are gone. And then everybody's surprised when they don't have time for questions. So if someone tells me 15 minutes, I come in my draft at 12. One of the other advantages of that is very often if something happens in the room, I can respond to it in the moment without being thrown off on time. Or if I remember, and this happens to me all the time, another like great example, or I'm able to, as I'm giving my talk, make a connection to the person who just went before me and sort of say, as Andrea was just saying about the book, and but I have those moments that I can put in there to make my talk more fluid and to make my talk seem more organically part of what's going on in the room, because I haven't pushed myself to that back limit. I can make the joke or whatever needs to happen in the moment to make this work. You also want to try to speak slowly enough so that people can understand you. Whatever media you make, and this might be a PowerPoint, this might be handout, it might be nothing. You don't have to take anything else in the room besides you and your voice. But most people do make PowerPoints or Prezzies or whatever you're going to make in this time. Just make sure that, just like on the PowerPoint I'm using now, that you just have those keywords, that it's not every single word that you're gonna say. My favorite PowerPoints that I use in giving talks are almost all images, which is wonderful. But what happens when you overdo it, when you just have paragraphs and paragraphs, is as soon as you hit the space bar and the next slide comes up, people stop listening to you and they read that slide. They don't hear what you say. So you gotta keep them focused. I mean, if it's absolutely important that they see that whole paragraph because maybe your whole paper is about that whole paragraph, that's fine. Put it up in the beginning, give everybody time to read it, then talk, instead of competing with your own PowerPoint for their attention. I think it's very important to proofread your media, and I know that I say that, and hopefully every single one of you are like, well, duh. Except if you go to conferences, you will see people do not proofread their media. If you are in a text box in PowerPoint, even if you have the spell check thing running, it isn't checking the text box usually. And a lot of people don't take the time to actually read their own materials. I was recently at a conference and a guy had, he was talking about a film and he ended up just in these couple of words making two mistakes. So he said, it is roll. So he's got the wrong roll. He's got it is instead of it's. And his ethos, his credibility goes down. It becomes distracting to the people listening to him when they're like, dude, because for a second you're like, dude, did you not even look at this? And you're no longer listening to his ideas because you're focused on the mistake. please make sure that you can pronounce all of the words that you plan to say, and this is part of rehearsal. I was looking for ways to distract myself yesterday, and those of you who are also very tense about the election understand why. But one of the things I did was I went on Facebook and I said, I'm giving a talk tomorrow to grad students and postdocs about conference presentations, and I ordered my Facebook friends to entertain me by telling me about conference fails. And one of my friends said that one of the first conferences she went to, a woman came to a word in her own presentation and said to the audience, hey, can anybody tell me how you pronounce this word? And they did, but it's also like, you knew you didn't know how. You couldn't check with somebody though. And of course now with the internet, the way it works, you can actually just have the internet tell you how to do that, but it's important. I will say to you that one of the saddest presentations that I ever saw, I was at a very intimate conference in Oxford. It was so cool. Just 21 people. We were together for 3 full days for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and everything in between. There were no other rooms happening, just all of us in the room together, everybody hearing everybody's paper, everybody talking about those ideas. But one of the participants could not participate with us. She had come over from Japan. Her paper was actually on an American object. She wrote her paper about Wonder Bread, which is an American product. She had written her paper, it was pretty clear, in Japanese, and then just put her paper through an auto translator. And so she was reading the paper, and it sounded weird because, you know, auto translators don't really work that well. But the problem wasn't that. It was that she did not speak English well enough to be able to take a single question. And people were being really nice about it, and they kept trying to find different ways to rephrase it. But she just didn't, I mean, she could never ask any of us questions. We couldn't ask her questions. We couldn't even talk about whether the lunch was good. So make sure you can pronounce the words, and make sure that you are going to be able to participate in the conference. I mean, that's the whole point of them, because we thought some of what she was saying was really cool, but we couldn't help her reformulate those ideas, and she couldn't help us reformulate ours. But that's what the whole thing is about. So do make sure that you can talk to us. All right. I've seen many students try very hard to sound smart. And so they pick the longest word instead of the best word. They pick the most jargony way to put something. But remember, people are listening to you, and they're at a conference where they're listening all day. You're listening to me right now, and some of you are probably already fatigued. And it's not because you're not smart, and it's not that I'm doing anything wrong. It's just we have a problem with focus. We have a problem with listening right now. There's Zoom fatigue that's happening too. And you need to make sure that you are not burying your ideas under that jargon, that you're not using words that don't make any sense. I haven't seen the following example at conferences, but my students do it sometimes. I've had many students talking about fixing social problems, and they will say something, for example, about the suffrage at the border. They're talking, my students, about the suffering at the border. Suffrage sounds fancier. It has nothing to do with suffering. Suffrage is the right to vote. And so then I have to point out to my students, you're complaining about the right to vote. It's just the wrong word. And, you know, them trying to sound smart does the opposite. Be clear. We want to hear your ideas. The length of the words, that's not what should impress us. All right. You have to do a short talk. You're not the keynote speaker who gets an hour. Announce what you won't talk about. Is it hard to get what I'm going to say down to that 12 minutes? Of course it is. I have to oversimplify a lot of things. I have to cut a lot of things out. That's just part of this. And sometimes, you know, what I will have said in my abstract is, I'm going to talk about these 4 works. And then when it's time to write that paper, I go, oh, why did I say I could talk about 4 works? I was not thinking about 12 minutes. And so what I will announce at the beginning of my paper, and this announcement is part of the 12 minutes, that what I'm talking about today is part of a longer project. In the longer project, I talk about these 4 works. In today's talk, I only have time to talk about this one of them, but I'm happy to take questions about all 4 in the Q&A. If something is super complicated, or if there's a part of your presentation that you haven't worked out yet, because this is a work in progress, you can say, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about this. I am not talking about this. And people, if you just say it, they will respect that. And then they don't come at you. And people don't usually come at you anyway, but they won't come at you if you're clear about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. So make that announcement. Ask if you want specific feedback for that specific feedback. I've seen a lot of scholars, and this works very well, saying, you know, I, at the end, when you're asking a question, would also love suggestions about, and sometimes, you know, I go to a lot of pedagogy panels, which are panels about teaching, and someone will say, I'm really interested for suggestions on how to do this in the classroom. And then they get those suggestions. Or they'll say, I'm looking for more examples of this in pop culture. And the audience loves that, because they're like, I want to be the person to be that helpful person. And so they raise their hands and they're like, I thought of something for you. And that's what you want. You do not have to pretend to have everything figured out. Free cat in your video. You do not have to pretend that you know everything. You don't have to pretend that this is finished. You can get the feedback. That is the whole point of these conferences in the first place, where we share ideas, and it's wonderful. And put that, again, that request in your 12 minutes. Rehearse with your friends, your enemies if possible. You just have to make sure that whoever you're rehearsing with is honest with you. And so you might tell them, you know, pretend that you know nothing about my project. Sit down and listen. Ask them to critique whatever visuals you have. Ask them if there was any part where they got bored or got lost. Ask them what the strongest moments were, and you'll get that good feedback to make sure something's working. You know, when we go over our own work, we won't notice that we've made this huge assumption here, or that, you know, an audience doesn't actually necessarily know the work we're talking about. And you know, we should give like a 2-sentence summary of it before we start deconstructing it. One of the absolute biggest mistakes that I made at a conference with my work wife, writing partner, we went to a narrative medicine conference, and we were specifically talking about how to teach our pre-med students to write case studies and to use metaphors in their case studies to explain complicated scientific ideas to a lay audience, right? That metaphor of this complicated thing is like this simple thing, and I'm gonna explain to you in this way. We gave our whole presentation. It was a great presentation, except the first question. This was in Europe, by the way. This is kind of important for this story. The first question, a doctor raised her hand and said, okay, but what's a metaphor? And we were like, oh no, oh no, oh crap. We were not thinking about the fact that our European audience, who specializes earlier than an American audience, hasn't had any humanities work like in college at all. They might not have even gotten much humanities work in high school. And so we sort of take for granted that metaphor is a word we can throw around in the United States, and we can usually throw it around in the United States at a conference. But we totally screwed that up. It was the curse of knowledge. Now, running it by a friend isn't necessarily going to fix that. But running your stuff by as many people as possible is the only way to try to stop those really big assumptions from happening, or that, can you just back up real quickly, just for those people who might have forgotten what this means, give that piece of information. Talking is better than reading. This is the hardest piece of advice. This is the one, and by hardest, I mean the hardest one to follow. If I were simply reading to you right now, it would be pretty deathly, right? I wouldn't be looking at you. I mean, I have words, but you'll see these are the presentation slides, and there's just a couple of words written in pencil. Like, but if I had written out every single word and I was just reading to you, you would hate this. I mean, some of you might hate this anyway, but you would definitely hate this if that's all that I was doing. When you're new, it's harder to talk and it's safer to read, but you want to think about whether you're going to be able to move out of that at one point. When I go to conferences, the people who are reading have audiences who are on their phone or on their computer. I've even seen people like working on their own presentation and completely forgetting this person. And when you're that person reading and you do look up and no one's looking at you because they're all doing something else, you lose confidence. They're not listening. They're not going to be able to ask you any good questions. That's not what you want. If you can actually talk, it makes it better. And maybe there's a particularly complicated thing you want to say that you want to have written down. That's fine. Should you still have notes? Yeah, go ahead. I still have notes for what we're doing today to remind me of some of the examples. Like on one of the slides, I have suspicion written down just to prompt me to share that, to remember to share that story with you. Maybe the first or second time you give a talk, instead of reading all the way through from first word to last, maybe you say, for this ending where I just need to wrap it up, maybe that's where I can look up at my audience and wing it just for a second, that last sentence. But it should be something over the course of your career that you're trying to get better at. Sometimes I wonder, if when people come up and say, oh my God, I really enjoy your talk, I wonder, well, like, is it fair though? Is it necessarily because I said something more brilliant than the other speakers? Or is it because I did not read to you while looking down? I looked out at you and spoke. And sometimes that's all it is, but they're not thinking about why they liked it more necessarily that way, but they did, usually like it more. So if you can, try to talk instead of read. And again, if you're afraid that you're going to lose it, fine, have the printout back up. Keep it in your pocket. Keep it on your phone. And then if your brain leaves, you have it. You can say, my brain just left. I'm a little nervous. Okay, Kat, you cannot look across the computer. He thinks he can. Tell people your brain just left. You're going to get out your notes and they'll be fine with that. I promise. Okay. As you're getting ready, you have your talk, what to pack. Pack layers and a scarf. For those of you who haven't been to conferences before, you might not know that some rooms are swelteringly hot. They are saunas for some reason that you have to exist in all day. Some rooms are frigid ice cold. So you need to pack those layers. I said a scarf too, because sometimes you have lunch right before your panel, somebody bumps into you, a little stain goes here, but sweater or scarf, hey, you can always just tell people at the beginning of your talk, I spilled chicken tikka masala here. But it can sometimes feel more comforting to have that scarf or that sweater that you can put on and feel better. I said comfortable shoes, but I really mean comfortable everything. Sometimes at conferences, I feel like I can tell who's a baby scholar and who's a grown-up old person and scholar by how they're dressed in terms of formal versus casual. And it's not that the old grown-up scholars are all formal. It's often the younger scholars who are dressed very formally in what looks like very uncomfortable clothes. Like you can look down and see the blister forming on this pair of shoes that's never been worn before. Where you can see somebody just doesn't feel comfortable in their clothes. I'm not at all telling you to dress like a slob. And part of asking people about how a conference goes is you can even ask them, how formal do people dress? I'm sure you've all seen those professors who wear a Hawaiian shirt no matter what the temperature is and no matter what the occasion is. They could be meeting the president of the UC system, they could be teaching class, they're going to be in that Hawaiian shirt. Those guys are also in their Hawaiian shirts at the conference. I dressed up very formally my first couple conferences, but when I looked around, my peers, these other people presenting, especially people who'd been doing it for longer, they looked comfortable, and a lot of them were just wearing what they would wear to teach. And so I started dressing like that, and it helped, of course, that I was getting more confident as a speaker. But just realizing I don't have to look uncomfortable. And now sometimes I have a couple of books on the television show The Simpsons, and if I'm giving a presentation on The Simpsons, I wear a Simpsons shirt, and no one has ever blinked an eye because it's appropriate to the topic. And they came to see a paper on The Simpsons, so it's not like they're going to be freaked out that there's a Simpsons shirt in the room. But you don't want to be in that situation where you're giving your first paper, but you've got a bloody blister on your foot, or you're wearing something that you bought that is way too tight around your waist or whatever it is. You want to feel comfortable in your own skin so that you're not thinking about those things and you can just think about the audience. I want you to have, sorry, let me go back to the picture. This picture is from last year, the Popular Culture Association. This is me and 3 of my friends from grad school. We all go back to this conference to see each other and to hang out. And I pulled up this picture just so you can see we are accomplished women with lots of books and stuff between us. I'm the president of a society. We are not in uncomfortable suits. It's awesome. So just know you do not have to be in some weird, almost tuxedo thing. All right, but paper copies of everything. You never know what's going to happen. You do not know whether any of the AV is going to work. And so I never go without paper copies of my PowerPoint, so that in case the absolute worst thing happens, I still know the order I was going to give the information in. If I have a whole written out speech, of course, I'm going to have a paper copy of that. Again, if something happens. If there is something really, really, really important that my audience needs to see, maybe I'm talking about an art piece, they need to see the painting. I am not going to count on any of my electronics doing this. Is it going to be in the PowerPoint? Of course it is. Am I going to have backup copies? Of course they are. And sometimes when I haven't been able to get my computer to work to hook up to a system, if it's a small enough room, I've just turned the computer around so that they could see the screen. And as long as it's a very small room, that can work. But when I really need someone to see something, I have paper copies of that. And so I'll take 20, and I very rarely need it, but when I do need it, it's so awesome to have it there and to be able to do my paper and still have the audience see what I need them to see. Or sometimes, especially when I do more scientific things, like I have given papers before on some Atwood novels, applying some neurological studies on how the brain works to them. And literature people, when I go to literature conferences, a lot of them, the second I say neurological, their brains go, no, what is she doing? And so sometimes I'll have a kind of cheat sheet for them of some of those concepts that they're not that familiar with. And then they have that paper copy with those ideas on them that they can go back and reference if I start to lose them during the talk because I'm talking about something outside their realm of experience. I want you to have as many ways to access your material as possible. I believe in redundancy. So just like I'm going to have the reminders again at the end and give you the links again at the end, I always have my PowerPoint and my paper on the computer I have with me on a separate flash drive, which is packed in a separate place than the computer, right? So if my computer is in my backpack, then the flash drive is going to be on the suitcase. My cat's unhappy. I apologize. There's no way I can fix that. He's unhappy because he's not allowed to go outside anymore because there's a horrible, mean neighbor. And so I can't like put him in the bathroom to make him stop crying because that would make him stop crying more because then he'd be more trapped. I apologize. My neighbor's mean. So, right, if my backpack with my computer got stolen, I still have the flash drive. Everything then is also, of course, backed up into my Gmail. I've emailed it to myself. I've uploaded it to Canvas. It is in every single place so that I have access to it. And that just makes me feel a lot more comfortable. And sometimes I do have to go to one of those alternative sources. You know, after all of the years that I spent packing really carefully, like even when I travel domestically, I keep my passport with me and a backup credit card in a separate location in case my purse gets stolen. My purse got stolen a year and a half ago at a conference, and everybody was like, oh my God, what are you gonna do? And it was awful, like my inhaler was gone and stuff, but I was like, I'm still gonna be able to fly home. I have my passport and a backup thing. So, you know, things are still going to go wrong and you can't control for everything, but when you do make as many good plans as possible, when things go wrong, it doesn't mean it tanks the whole thing. So lots of ways to access your material. When you're at the conference, I'm sure many of you have heard the term elevator pitch, and this is when somebody says, hey, what are you working on? Can you give them that answer in the time it takes you to go down that floor? It's a sentence or two about what you're working on, and you definitely want to be able to do it at a conference. If somebody in the elevator or in the bathroom or at the buffet says, hey, what's your paper on? You need to be able to answer that. And I would also have a version of that that might be simpler for just the very nice person checking you in who asks what you're working on. And again, you do not have to go into all the details. Give the very broad strokes. If they want more information, they'll ask for it. But you can't get flustered when they say, hey, what are you going to talk about? And I have seen a lot of grad students do that. They're like, they get frozen just in headlights. What are you working on? And they just, and you kind of want to help them, like, okay, we're at a narrative medicine conference. Are you talking about patience? You know, not that I've ever done that. I wouldn't mock someone that way, but you know, you just want to make sure that you can do it. You want to have business cards or some other quick thing that you can give to them. One of my friends who was on a slide, PCA, ACA, what she taught me to do is when you have the lanyard is to put your business cards or, you know, little sticky notes with your name and email or something like in the back of that. And then you're wearing that around your neck. And so when someone comes up and says, hey, can I email you about that later? Instead of having to open your wallet or go into your backpack or something, you can just pull it out real quick. I also have a very short piece of advice if you're chairing. And those of you who haven't been to many conferences would be like, of course I wouldn't be chairing Karma one of my first times. Are you crazy? Except it happens all the time. At bigger conferences, they will just randomly sometimes pick someone on a panel and ask them to chair. You'll get this email like a week before the conference saying, hey, could you chair? What they're asking you to do is to start the session at the appropriate time, to make sure that everybody takes their time and to then moderate the questions and then to end it. The trick there is that you have to make everybody stay within their time. And that can be really hard, especially if you're a shy graduate student and you don't want to tell that person who just said they're a professor of blah, 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 to shut up, except you have to, because that professor might be a very inconsiderate person, and there's tons of them who go to conferences. And so if you know that you could never tell that person that their time is up, decline. Say, this is my first conference and I think I'll be too nervous or whatever, you know, and just decline. But if you are chairing, do keep people to their time. It's usually not that bad, but just every once in a while. You want to scope out the room, meaning don't stalk anybody, but just go look at the room. Make sure you know where it is. Make sure you know where the nearest bathroom is for when you realize you have to pee, you know, right before everything starts. You don't want to be wandering around the conference center for some hidden room that you thought you would have time to find. You want to get there early. Now, sometimes there's another presentation going on and I don't want you to barge in and interrupt everybody, but you want to get there not just when it's starting, but in the minutes before, so that you can load your AV or whatever else you need to do, or get your glass of water or put your stuff down and go take that last pee. But I do want you, and I think you saw this coming, to assume that the AV will fail. It does sometimes. It just does. You have to do your presentation anyway. You can't say, oh, if I don't have my PowerPoint, I guess I'll just sit this one out. No. Sometimes the computer just crashes. Sometimes the sound isn't working, you know, and you're trying to play a video. We have just, it's rare that I go to a conference where there isn't some problem in one of the rooms at one of the times. So you just have to be prepared for that. If you can't get your stuff to load, spend no more than a minute or two trying to do it, and then give up and do your presentation without it with your paper copies or whatever it is that you have. The audience will appreciate you not making them watch you figure it out for 10 minutes, which, as you know, is terribly, terribly boring. Speaking of that, I want you to be flexible as much as is possible, because that AV fail, or because, you know, you might find that you're the only person who showed up for that panel. That happened to me once. I was at a very big conference and there were supposed to be 3 of us talking and I was the only one who was there. The room was packed though. The audience was like standing room only. And I was supposed to have 20 minutes and I realized, oh crap. So I stood up and I said, all right, I was supposed to have 20 minutes, but since they're not here, I think I'm going to talk for 21 minutes. And, you know, the audience laughed. And also they were just really happy that I wasn't going to take the full hour and stretch it out and make it terrible. But sometimes you do have to be flexible. Sometimes in a conference, like this happened, I was at a conference in March in New Orleans as things were starting to shut down, and a bunch of people had not come to the conference because of COVID. And so they were condensing the panels. And so all of a sudden you thought you were on a 3-person panel, but now it was 4. And so now your paper had to be cut down because there was this other person. You have to be flexible about that. If you can, physically stand up. It's easier to watch people when they're physically standing up. I would be doing that if there were a way to configure where the computer was and stuff in my living room. The only place I can really put it and stand up for an hour is on the top of the cat tree. And I know from experience that that goes horribly wrong. So I'm sitting down now, but in person, I will always be standing up. You want to try to keep it light. If something goes wrong, try to make a joke about it. Try to laugh at yourself about it. And also, if you're super nervous and this is your first time, or you say a word that wasn't at all the word that you want to say, just acknowledge that. I've seen a lot of people say, I'm a little nervous. This is my first time. And then the audience is always so nice to them. Just crazy nice to them. We all are, because we all remember our first time and we remember how nervous we were. And we want you to have a great first time because we remember that feeling. I told you about the Facebook message I posted last night. One of my friends, who is also a dean here at UC Davis, said that she threw up all night the night before her first conference presentation. She also said she was unable to answer the first question that someone asked her at her first conference presentation. She survived it. She's a dean now. She's doing fine. But we've all been there. And so just own it, just say it, move forward. We'll get through it together. If you can, if there's someone that you know, have them take a picture of you. Sometimes we get asked for, material from our departments where they're like, we would like pictures of our, teachers and grad students in action. And so you might say, oh yeah, someone took a picture of me giving a talk. Here, I have this, then I can give you. So the last things I want to talk about are being a good colleague, and then we'll go to Q&A. Do not go over your time. 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 Ask your panelists, your co-panelists questions, especially if the audience is not helping. If they're not coming up and they turn to your colleague and say, I actually have a question about that or a comment about that. That's just part of being a good colleague. Don't talk over or interrupt other presenters. I should not have to say this, but I have seen many people, like, you're up there giving a talk, the 2 other people on your panel start whispering to each other. It is so distracting. It is so disrespectful. But the worst example of this I saw just a couple years ago. There was a panel. My best friend and work wife was giving her paper. There was a man on her panel. He had just given his paper. She was talking about a memoir that had been made into a movie. He interrupted her talk and said, I don't think that's true, because in documentary films, blah, 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 blah. And we all were just, everybody in the audience was sort of like, what just happened? And then she said, wait, stop. She said, I'm not talking about a documentary. The movie I'm talking about is it's not a documentary. But she was kind of frazzled. And then this guy, in the Q&A, people kept trying to ask her questions. They would start with her name, Melissa. Melissa, have you? And this guy would answer. He would jump in front of a question someone asked her and try to answer it. What a jerk. What an incredible jerk. Why didn't that get stopped, you ask? Some poor graduate student got asked to chair that panel. And at the end of everything, like, she came up and said, I'm so sorry, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. Like, this is my first conference. I didn't know how to stop him. And we were able to talk about it, but it was awful. Do not do that to people. let them give their talk. Crazy. You want to, of course, give the next panelists in the room a clean space, time to set up. People might be asking you great questions. Just take it outside. Don't leave your dirty water glass right there, your balled up piece of paper. Talk to people, of course, at the conference. I know a lot of you are shy, but you know, this is what the conference is about. If you're standing behind somebody in the coffee line and they also have the lanyard and you have the lanyard and you're like, I want to talk to somebody, but I don't know about what, ask them if they're enjoying the conference. Often when I'm trying to talk to someone at a conference, my first question is, have you seen any really great papers? What I really want to know is, have you seen any really bad stuff? Because that's always more fun because you're kind of gossip about stuff. You're there to embrace the new. You're going to be seeing somewhere new. You're going to be making new friends. You're going to be trying new food. You're going to be hearing new ideas. You're going to be experiencing new chaos. And one of the things that is just completely true about my conference experience is I know how to give a pretty good conference presentation now because I've screwed it up and I've seen other people screw it up and I've learned from those things. And I've seen people do really good things and then I've thought, oh, that really worked. I want to do something like that the next time I do. And so experience those new things, learn from those things. On this next slide, I have like my contact information and stuff. And while that's up there, I just want to leave you with an example of one of the worst presentations I ever sat through, but also the idea that, you know, if your conference paper goes well, what I will remember are your great ideas. I'm going to come away thinking about something in a way I haven't thought about it before. That's what I want. If something goes really wrong, I don't even remember what you talked about. I just remember that you were a jerk or, you know, something else. And that's, of course, not what you want. The worst conference presentation I ever saw, although the guy who was harassing Melissa is a runner-up. I was in London. I was at a conference. We all had, you know, we were supposed to have 20 minutes. And then there was time for Q&A. This guy couldn't get his AV equipment to work. The chair of the panel didn't stop him. He spent 20 minutes getting his AV equipment to work, the full 20 minutes. And then he gave his paper, which was 25 minutes. I was the last person on the panel. So the whole time this is happening, I'm like crossing things off my paper because he was eating up my time plus, and I wanted to still have a Q&A. He also did not proofread his PowerPoint and had some really confusing weird things on there. Like at one point he had the word feet, F-E-E-T, and I just stared. It was in the middle of this big paragraph and I could not figure out what that word was doing there. And I was not listening to him because I was trying to figure out what that word was doing there. And finally I figured out the word he wanted was fact, F-A-C-T, which is 50% right. He was talking about a movie and he got the plot wrong. And at first I thought he misspoke, but then he said the mistake again. I was like, I'm watching some jerk who's taking 45 minutes who didn't even understand the movie he's talking about. Again, I don't remember what his point was. I just remember those things. And that's why we want to make sure that somebody can focus on our ideas. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen so that we can go to Q&A for our remaining time. So I don't know whether you want to put questions in the chat or if you want to raise your hand. Okay, so Katrina says, I'm not sure if this is something in the case of the jerk. Yeah. You can tell him to stop. So again, it might be difficult if you're shy or something, but there are nice ways to shut people down in that kind of instance. And if for that, the person could have said, oh, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't make this clear. We're going to do questions and comments at the end. Right. The person who was at the London conference, that chair should have just, when it was 2 minutes into him trying to fix the equipment, said, it's not working, do it without it. But again, you do have to just kind of put your foot down. But again, you can say, you know, to be fair to the other panelists and to make sure we have time for questions, we have to start your paper now. And most people will be reasonable and accept that. You're not trying to shut them down because you don't like them. You're trying to make sure that the audience gets their time in. But some people do have to be, unfortunately, told what to do. One person had a question about, are we recording this? And yes, we are. And you'll have access to this talk after this. Making a memorable professional impression at conferences. So again, what I found is that standing up, talking, people remember what you say more than if you sat down and read. You're just not, the energy is just wrong in that situation. So even if your other panelists are seated, if there is a lectern there, say, you know, I've been sitting all day, I'm gonna stand up for my presentation. That gives you bonus energy points right there. And then following up for people that you meet at conferences. You know, it depends on what you want. If you met some famous scholar and what you want is help with your career for the rest of your life, that's tricky, because then you're like, I want to turn this real quick conversation into you mentoring me and getting me a job. And I don't know how to do that. But most people, if you share information, they are okay with keeping in touch with you. You know, we also, of course, are in the age of social media. And so I've met a lot of people at conferences, and then we're either following each other on Twitter or Instagram, even though I don't do much on Instagram, or Facebook or something. And that's a way to keep in touch. And then I've also just sometimes, you know, in the moment, I've realized that I read a book that would really help this other person. But of course, in the moment, I cannot remember the title of that book at all, you know? And so I'll say, can I have your card? Because of course, at 2 in the morning, I'm going to remember the name of the book. And they'll give me their card. And so when I have a chance, I'll send them an email. And I've had people do that for me too. Or like I was doing a theater workshop, and we were workshopping an author's play, and he said he knew that the ending was wrong. It wasn't working. And I thought of a way to end it. And so you know, I said to him, I think the last line should actually be said this way. And he got my information and followed up with me, because he thought about it for a while, and he goes, I do want it to end that way. And of course, he followed up with me to make sure that I was okay with him using that ending. And then we were able to talk a bit more over email for a while. So most people are happy, especially if you're going to be following up to tell them how you're interested in that idea, or to give them a little more advice, or even to say, you know, I would love to see what this becomes when maybe you work on it a little bit and publish it, like maybe send me a link, people like that. Asking for audience participation. Okay. The raise your hand if you have experienced, it depends on what you're asking them to cop to. For example, if you're asking someone to out themselves about something embarrassing, you know, some people, yes, I've done the embarrassing thing. I'm happy to that. But some people who are shy will not raise their hand. And then you're putting them in an awkward position. Or raise your hand if you predict XXX outcome. That's a better one that you can do. I've seen some audience participation though go on way too long, where I feel like this person is spending way too much time trying to get me to do their work for them as an audience member. I went to a conference in Berkeley a few years ago, and the people had everybody in the audience introduce themselves before the panel. And they said they were doing that to like create a safe space and collaboration, except it took up the whole time. And so I do not know what anybody's ideas were. There was this weird Q&A, but only one guy got to ask a question because we'd spent so much time learning that, oh, that lady 2 people down from me, her name is Judy, and she lives in blah. And I'm like, that is not, that's not why I came to this. So you can overdo it. You can definitely overdo it. But the raise your hand, especially early in a talk, raise your hand if you think, you know, like maybe I would say, okay, I surveyed my students on this. How many of you think they all knew that? Guess what? Only 15% knew that. You know, that can be kind of fun. Does anybody else have a question? All right. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for putting up with technical stuff and for sad crying cats. I hope that your first conference experience is wonderful, but just remember, even if it's not, you're going to learn from that experience that's not. And also that next time you give a paper, if you had a really big fail, you can go in with such confidence going, it could never be as bad as that time when I had food poisoning and threw up over, but you know, so enjoy it. The conferences are fun. Try to make them fun. Bye, everybody.